So good morning children. Let us continue the chapter which we stopped midway, that is diversity in living organisms. Okay. So we were discussing about that how organisms do not appear similar to each other. Okay. They are going to show difference in their function, appearance and number of cells. So what do we call them as? We call them as variations. Fine. So these variations are nothing but the characteristics of an individual. Okay, so that make it unique in this on this planet. Fine. So these variations, as we said, the forms, the functions, whatever we are talking about, they can be termed as characteristics. Yeah. So these characteristics are the criteria for studying the various types of organisms. So when we take these characteristics, we see that the organisms are not alike. They are going to have differences or the variations ranging from minute to very huge variations. Clear, children? So thereby what happens is that these characteristics are the criteria for even grouping the organisms. So now what are those characteristics? They can be number of cells, types of cells, okay, types of organs, maybe the mode of the feeding habits, maybe the place where they live, or maybe the kind of genetic material what they have. So all these differences will make us convenient, will help us to conveniently group these organisms. So when we are grouping these organisms, we call this as classification. And why are we grouping or why are we classifying the organisms? For the purpose of convenient study, okay, and to know their common features or common characteristics, and as well as to know the interrelation between one organism and the other organism. So the characteristics are what the basis for classification. Fine. Now another basis for classification would be evolution. I hope you all must have heard this word. What is evolution? Evolution is nothing but the process by which the new organisms develop from the pre-existing organisms. Now when I use the word evolve means to grow, to develop. Then the question comes, how did they evolve or how did they grow, or what made them different from the previous organism or from the other organism? That is the evolving in terms of the characteristics. So when we talk about the evolution, it starts with the simplest characteristic and goes to the complex characteristics. Now what is that complex characteristic? Maybe the appearance of the number of tissues, the various types of organisms, the various types of organs. Okay, the complex organs. That means the division of labor keeps on evolving. So any classification will start from the simplest or the primitive and will go to the most complex or the modern organism. Now where have all these come from? They all have originated from the genetic material and a single cell. Of course, developing or giving developing some new types of traits which were different from one organism to the other. So evolution was also the key feature in grouping the organisms. Fine, children. So now these classification of living things was done by various scientists. Okay. So and it was not that in one effort itself the classification of living organisms was done. Okay, so it started. I would like to just mention there were many scientists who contributed for grouping the organisms or for classification of the living organisms. But here I would like to mention about the three most important scientists whose contribution was we can say very important, and also which about whom you are dealing in the present chapter. Fine. So the first contribution, let us talk, was by whom? Was by none other than the father of biology, that is Aristotle. So you can say the foundation of classification was laid by Aristotle. Okay, but then since when we talk about Aristotle, who existed before Christ, the information about the various life forms was limited. So the classification what he did, or what the basis what he took for classification, was very simplest. And what were those key features what he took into consideration? The mobility, whether they are able to move from one place to other place, then the habitat, the place where they live, and then their feeding habits. So depending upon this, Aristotle first classified all the living organisms. But his classification had majorly two groups. One, the plants, and the other, animals. Again, the plants were further divided. Why these plants and animals were divided? Based on two features. One, the mobility, and the other was the feeding habit. That is, they were autotrophic and these were heterotrophic. Then again further, plants were divided based upon their sizes of the stem. Similarly, animals were divided based on their habitat, whether they have the type of blood, whether it is a red blood or non-red blood, etc. Okay. Then whether they had a backbone or not, without any backbone. So this was the fundamental, we can say the simplest form of classification. But then as the discoveries happened, inventions happened, we came to know that there are various types of life forms which cannot be grouped either under plants or under animals. So we can say that this Aristotle's classification was no more applicable. Then another effort or another contribution was done by another great scientist named as Carlos Linnaeus. Okay, so Carlos Linnaeus is also called as the father of taxonomy. Okay, what is taxonomy? The naming of or the classification of the organisms. Fine. Now he was the person who divided, again he continued with the concept of plants and animals, but he also talked about the photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic organisms like green algae and fungi. Okay, he also made an attempt in order to give an hierarchy. And if you remember, we discussed about this. So this is the hierarchy based on which organisms will be placed under a set category, set level of this hierarchy that starts from kingdom and ends with what? Species. And what is the first top order of hierarchy? Kingdom, which would be, you can say, it is at the base, wherein maximum organisms are accommodated. Then comes next is phylum for animals, division for plants. So gradually as we come down from phylum to class to order to family to genus and to species, we see that the number of organisms keep on decreasing, but the number of characteristics which are taken into study are going to increase. So maximum organisms we find in the kingdom and the minimum we find in the species, but with more number of characteristics. And this was contributed by none other than who? By Carlos Linnaeus. Okay, children. So this was one example which we have already discussed, like how a lion and lion has been placed in the hierarchy. Okay, where it comes in kingdom and under where it lands, where it is placed as a species. As a species, it is only one. Okay, but as a kingdom, it is in a group. Fine, children. But then, as I told, the division, classification which was done by even Carlos Linnaeus was not satisfactory, because by that time we came to know about the microscopic organisms. Then a group of these three scientists by name Robert Whittaker, Carl Woese and Ernest Haeckel proposed a five-kingdom classification. Okay, so we can say this is the modern modern form of classification, which is also referred as five-kingdom classification. This is near to perfect classification. Of course, we cannot say it is a perfect means of classification, because it also has got its own drawbacks. But then it is the very closest to perfect classification, and the major contribution was done by whom? Robert Whittaker, along with these two scientists by name Ernest Haeckel and Carl Woese. Where Ernest Haeckel proposed 4 kingdoms, Carl Woese proposed actually 6 kingdoms. So which along with Robert Whittaker, they brought it to what? 5 kingdoms. Am I clear, children? So now let us just see now before we go on to what are those 5 kingdoms, let us take what were the criteria for classifying the organisms in 5 kingdoms. So the Whittaker and his team took 3 main characteristics or 3 main criteria for grouping the organisms. The first one was the genetic material, in the sense whether it is surrounded by a nuclear membrane or whether it is not enclosed by a nuclear membrane. Of course, now I hope you can now recall the terms which we use. Yes, the without a nuclear membrane, prokaryotes; with a nuclear membrane, eukaryotes. Okay. Similarly, then came another criteria, number of cells. Yes, whether they are single cell, whether they are multicellular. Then another criteria was the mode of nutrition, whether they prepare their own food, whether they depend upon the other organisms. So autotrophs, heterotrophs. Now children, apart from this, they also considered one more criteria, that was presence or absence of a cell wall. Okay, so even this was one more criteria which was included by the by Whittaker and his team. Okay, children. So now let us see what are those 5 kingdoms. So those 5 kingdoms are Monera. If we will start in the order, start with what? As I told, the division starts with the primitive to the most modern and complex, well developed. Okay, so the primitive is the Monera, the single-celled organisms. Then comes Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So these are the 5 kingdoms of the living organisms proposed by Whittaker. Okay, children. So today we just had an introduction about who proposed 5 kingdom classification and the contribution by the other scientists. So we'll continue about this classification, about these 5 kingdoms in our coming classes. So thank you. Have a good day.